Hi, first grade. It is Wednesday, which means it is time for another read aloud. This month is Black History Month, and each week of this month we are going to be focusing on a different key hero in Black history. So this week we are focusing on Ruby Bridges. So we are going to read the story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was the first African American girl that was able to go to an all-white school in Louisiana, in New Orleans. So we're going to read the story of Ruby Bridges. She was a very important little girl. It says, Ruby was born in a small cabin near Tylerton, Mississippi. We were very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job. And that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I think I was 4. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, her mother went to work scrubbing the floors in the bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in William France Elementary. She was the same age as you guys. Ruby's parents were very proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in such an amazing event in American history. They went to church. They sat and they prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that they'd be strong and have courage to get through any trouble, and that Ruby would be a good girl and she would hold her head high and be credit to her own people and a credit to the African American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the France Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some people wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building, and the marshals had to carry guns. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the France school surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair, carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry quickly through the crowd and not say a word. So Ruby was being kind of bullied, right? They weren't being very nice to her because they thought people with dark skin were different than people with white skin. So they didn't want them to go to the same school together. And people who had white skin didn't want their kids to be at the same school with people who had dark skin. It was really not nice and kind of silly. It says the white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school with Ruby. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Miss Hurley. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, or to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite, and she worked well at her desk. Miss Hurley said she enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom and in an empty building. She was the only student there because nobody wanted to send their kids to school with a girl who had dark skin. Sometimes I'd look at her and I'd wonder how she did it, said Miss Hurley. How she went by all those mobs and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Miss Hurley would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being relaxed and hopeful, or if she would gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school at all. So Ruby was being very brave. She was being a very brave little girl, and Miss Hurley was so surprised. Then one morning something happened. Miss Hurley stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped. Right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people, she stood there facing all those men and women. It seemed as though she was talking to them. So all the people that were yelling at her, it looked like Ruby was talking to her. Miss Hurley saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what she could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby would not budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Miss Hurley asked her what happened. Miss Hurley told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked to the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk to them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Miss Hurley said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who were so mean to her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of an angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby again hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive the people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. You could forgive them, just like you did the people a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." So Ruby was a very brave little girl. So this is just some more information. It says, later that year, two white boys joined Ruby at France Elementary. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into trouble around the house and when they could have been in school learning. The mob got very angry when the boys first went back to school, but soon those boys were joined by other children. "We've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands," one parent said. "It's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's right to go to school and get an education." They all did get their education, Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls who went to school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's orders in New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to France school. She graduated from there and then went on to high school. Ruby Bridges is now married to a building contractor and has 4 sons who all attend school within the New Orleans public school system. Now a successful businesswoman, she has created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation for the purpose of increasing parental involvement in schools. So that is all about Ruby Bridges. Each week of this month, we will learn about a different key hero in Black history, and this week we are talking all about Ruby Bridges. So make sure you do your assignment on Class Kick, do your social studies assignment, it'll be all about her. Have a good day.